Welcome to the podcast. Today, my guest is Will Sargison. We're shooting from a different space. This is actually in the main area of the recording studio. And main reason for that is because Will's going to play a bit of piano on an actual piano. Yeah. So, where did you get started playing music?
I'm from Napier in New Zealand, and my dad was a bass player in rock bands, pub bands, a weekend warrior, I guess you could say. It was never his full-time job, but he played regularly most weekends. He was out playing in bands. And apparently, as the story goes, I showed quite an innate sort of an aptitude for music as a very little kid, as a toddler.
Oh, wow.
And it was suggested to my parents that I should be given lessons at a suitable age, 4 or 5. So when I turned 5 on my 5th birthday, Dad got me a Casio keyboard, little cheap 5-octave thing, and lessons began immediately. Sorry, it was Christmas actually when I was 5, not my birthday. So I was about 5.5 years old, and lessons began. And we skipped all of the classical. It was straight into blues and boogie woogie because my dad had an appreciation for that stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So when you say straight into that style, did that mean that it was more teaching not theoretical stuff, or?
That's right, yeah. We certainly skipped the orthodoxy of theory. I never did scales, never did a scale a day in my life, which horrifies some people to learn. I know what they are.
You would never know listening to the way you play now.
Yeah, but my dad gave me a lot of, because he had learned the orthodox method as a teenager on piano before he had switched to bass later. He had learned, I think he got to grade 4 or 5 on piano as a teenager in the 50s.
So he had a bit of knowledge, theoretical knowledge behind him.
He did, yeah, and he, to this day, he can transcribe things, write them on the staff. If he wants to write out a bass line for something, he can write it out on the staff. He's quite particular in that respect, but what he gave me mostly was sort of what I call bandstand knowledge. You know, this is the 5 chord. This is the function that it serves. This is an augmented chord. Hear that sound? Hear the tension? That means we're probably going to go to the 4 chord next, and things like that. So
there was theoretical knowledge involved, but you just didn't do the classical grade system.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was more practical, I guess, knowledge rather than orthodox knowledge out of a book.
And so did the lessons come from your dad, or did you have outside influences other than your dad?
It was mostly my dad, but there were outside influences in terms of, like, my dad wanted to start me on blues and boogie, and he had a friend who actually just coincidentally just passed away. We were just talking about him off camera.
Oh, right, yeah.
Who had a book of boogie woogie piano sheet music. And that became a key part of my earliest training, was the transcriptions of boogie woogie pianists contained in that book.
Wow.
But I mean, that's something that perhaps we would have sought out of our own volition had he not happened to have owned that book. We might have looked and have found that book. But
can you give us a quick example of a boogie woogie type thing on a piano?
Yeah, sure. So it's characterised by what the left hand is doing, and normally it's 4/8 to the bar, sort of a classic left-handers. So it's very similar to what became rock and roll piano. Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, they were essentially boogie woogie pianists with just a bit more flair and bravado and glitters up and down the piano, a bit more showmanship. But it's essentially, rock and roll piano is boogie woogie piano, basically.
So like a lot of 1-4-5 progressions.
Yeah, almost exclusively 12-bar blues.
Oh, okay. So you started out there, and then how did things progress from there?
So I played sort of almost entirely boogie woogie and blues piano. Those two are very closely related. They're like brothers. You know, boogie woogie came out of blues and sort of peaked in the 30s, I guess, and then became a big band phenomenon in the 40s. So I was playing exclusively that almost for probably the first 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then when I was about 9, I think it was, a friend of my dad, a pianist who he used to play in bands with in the 70s, who lived around Napier, said, "Oh, your son's playing boogie woogie. I've got this Dr. John solo piano record that he ought to check out. There's a couple of boogie woogie tracks on there." And Dad said, "Yeah, great. I know Dr. John. Let's have a listen." So we took that record home, and we really liked what we heard on there. I really dug the boogie tunes. Besides the boogie tunes on there, there was this other style that I later found out was New Orleans R&B. Came out of guys like Professor Longhair, Alan Toussaint, James Booker. Now you'd hear guys like John Cleary or Harry Connick Jr. play that style. They're carrying the torch now. And that was similar to boogie woogie. It still had that bluesy thing running through it, but it was fundamentally different. You'd had the sort of like a rumba thing going on, and then sort of funky blues over that. Sort of thing. So, and I really dug that, and no one was playing it, so I headed in that direction. And then later it became stride piano, which is another thing altogether, and then finally mainstream jazz.
Just a quick interruption. It's very early days for us, and we're trying to grow things, and you can help. Please share, hit the subscribe button. It makes a massive difference. Thank you very much. Yeah, because the stride piano thing, I do remember that being quite a thing for a while. And that's something that's quite, from my understanding, is not an easy thing to play either.
It's very physically demanding and daunting. It sort of terrified me a little bit for a long time. I did have stride piano sheet music earlier before I really got into it in earnest. I had Fats Waller transcriptions, and I would sort of have a bit of a ham-fisted crack at it, but I was cutting corners all over the place, especially where the left hand's concerned, because there's a lot of big jumps, like all with the left hand. I'm doing that with two hands but there's ways of simplifying that, you know. You can make the jump smaller.
No, I think I've seen you do the thing where it's like it's quite a big thing. Is that something that you have to practice to be able to keep the ability to do it? Is that?
It would help. I don't shed that stuff as much as I ought to, but these days. But there was a time when I paid my dues pretty hard shedding that stuff. But it wasn't really until I was about 15 or 16. I was at a jazz festival, and a German stride pianist had come out to perform, a guy named Bernd Lotsky. And it was the first time I'd ever seen stride piano played live, and it was like, wow, this is really gnarly. I need to do this. And so I went from sort of dabbling with it and cutting corners to really jumping in and transcribing stride pieces from the 30s, the 20s.
Oh, okay. So when you're transcribing it, I guess you're doing that all by ear. How do you know that you're getting it right?
I'm sure this relates to you as well. I mean, the ear is something that's continually evolving. I find even I'm in my mid-40s now, and my ear is continuing to evolve. I can now identify certain voicings and intervals maybe that I would have been harder to identify even 5 or 10, 15 years ago. So it was like a muscle that I just had to flex.
Yeah.
And what did help was a trick of my dad's. He had an old reel-to-reel tape machine. A lot of the things I wanted to transcribe we had on vinyl.
Yep.
He would record the track from vinyl onto the reel-to-reel. He'd then slow the reel-to-reel to half speed, dropping the pitch an octave, and then we'd record that slowed down version of the recording from the reel-to-reel onto a cassette, and then I'd transcribe from the cassette at half speed on a ghetto blaster next to the piano.
Oh, wow.
So that just gives you a lot more time in these fast runs to hear what was going on. So that was a big help.
Yeah. You're 15 or 16, so you're transcribing stride piano. Where does that take you from there? So obviously at that age you're performing live. Are you performing with your dad?
No, Dad had more or less quit playing by probably the early 80s. He dabbled here and there after that, but he largely sort of left the gigging scene behind and moved into other ventures. He was quite a prolific builder, and he was building houses, garages. He built he was into fiberglass manufacturing, had his hand in a lot of pies.
Yeah.
And his enthusiasm for music kept up, but he wasn't really in the gigging scene anymore after that. So we rarely performed together. There was a handful of occasions where we did, but
Was it a fairly thriving live scene in Napier?
not really. Although compared to now, it was. In the late 90s, you could go downtown. Napier's a town about the size of Harvey Bay. You know, it's really not a big place. But you could go downtown in the 90s and hear 4 or 5 live bands playing, and you'd be lucky to hear 1 or 2 now.
Wow.
For various reasons, you know. All the,
Yeah, the world's a changing place. And there's a lot of reasons why. COVID would have, I think, put a big dent in a lot of live venues
yep.
and for a lot of other reasons too. People going out, people don't have as much disposable income as they used to.
True.
You could probably name 10 different reasons why. But you're still gigging quite a lot now. How far do you have to travel in order to maintain a full-time gigging calendar?
Not too far. I mean, I've got the advantage of living almost right in the middle of Brisbane City. I live in Wollongabba. I was in Kangaroo Point before that. So most of the venues I play are sort of within 5 Ks of my place, which is great. I've set that up by design. You know, I want to live right in the guts of it.
Are you playing with bands or mainly solo?
Mostly with bands. Like probably 5% of my gigs are solo, if that. Which is rather odd because I feel like a solo pianist first and foremost. Growing up, I felt that way. That's really my forte. I've got an enormous solo piano repertoire that rarely bleeds over into my band repertoire. So in a way, my solo piano skill set is sort of withering on the vine. But for the fact that I play at home and occasionally play a solo piece on a band gig, just as a little showpiece.
Yeah.
You know, when I was with Galapagos Duck, we'd regularly do that. I'd play a solo piece here and there because boogie woogie and stride piano is not something you really hear anymore.
In a band context, was that stride piano meant to be in a band context? Or was that something that was a solo piano thing?
A bit of both. I've heard it said, and I don't know if it's an urban myth, but that because the recording techniques were so primitive in the 20s, that when the pianist took a solo, it was being picked up so poorly by the microphones that everyone would have to virtually drop out so that the piano could be heard. But then the whole guts of the groove dropped out in the process of the band dropping out.
Oh, okay.
So the left hand had to really step up to carry the groove in the absence of all those other instruments. So that might have been it may have been born out of technical limitations rather than a stylistic thing.
Wow.
I'm not entirely sure if that's true. I need to go back and do some more research on that. But a lot of stride piano recordings are solo.
All throughout your career, have you ever gone back and revisited the classical piano thing?
Not really. I've checked out next to no Bach or Mozart or Beethoven. I'm a big Chopin fan, and I love Louis Moreau Gottschalk because he's from New Orleans, and he's sort of the first guy in a New Orleans piano lineage that I feel very attached to and have looked into a lot. But I don't ever play Chopin stuff apart from goofing around a little bit at home. I'm certainly not a classical pianist. I haven't put the time into the tiniest subtle nuances of playing in the way that classical piano is really all about.
Yeah.
You know, the pressing down of the note in the most meticulous manner. I cut a lot of corners there. I wouldn't say I've got crude technique, but compared to a professional classical pianist, I probably do.
So when you're first starting, and you're learning from your dad and picking up from other sources wherever you can, how do you go about knowing what is correct technique? Does that something your dad knew? Because he'd obviously done grades up to a certain point.
He had. I don't really ever really remember that being addressed. Correct fingering, correct hand posture, correct physical posture. How I didn't come out as a pounder, you know what I mean?
Yes.
A lot of self-taught pianists are sort of pounders, especially in the boogie-woogie realm because it's quite a fast, physical, loud sort of a thing. So I don't know how I didn't come out as a pounder. I've got a fairly light, delicate touch. That's a bit of a mystery to me. But those things weren't really addressed when I was learning.
When you're doing band gigs, do you get the chance to play on real piano very often, or is it more a case of an electronic keyboard?
It's probably about 70-30. 70% of the time it's on a keyboard and 30 on a piano. There's pros and cons to both. With a keyboard, even though it's a fairly crude imitation of the real thing, at least you know what you're getting. I could turn
it's
up,
always in tune.
It's always in tune. I can sculpt the sound in any number of ways on the fly, which is great. If I turn up to a venue and there's a crappy piano, there's not a lot I can do about that. You know, I don't have the facility to tune it. It might need more maintenance than that. I'm screwed. You know, I just have to deal with it. And that's been the curse of the pianist, really. They're always having to play someone else's instrument wherever they go. It's never been the case for guitarists, horn players, anyone, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Well, drummers to some degree sometimes
Yes.
have to turn up and go, this is what you've got.
That's right. They can sympathise a little. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. So you're in Napier. Obviously, at some point you moved to Australia. What was the impetus for that?
Well, I was doing cruise ships. That was sort of a full-time job of mine from 2001 till 2008, and I'd fulfilled 11 contracts between 3 and 6 months each. So I actually spent 4.5 years on the ocean in that 7 years.
Did you like the boat thing?
I liked aspects of it. It made me a far better musician, a far better reader, a far more well-rounded and sensitive and understanding musician. In terms of different genres, different bags, how to play in a band with a guitarist and not be stepping on each other's toes. There's a whole lot of nuances there that I probably would not have learned or not as quickly if I had not done ships. I love the travel aspect of it, going through the Caribbean, Mediterranean, Alaska, Hawaii. I mean, I've always loved geography and, wow, I wonder what it's like there. And I got to do a lot of those things. But
do you get to see the musical aspects of those particular places you visited as well?
A little bit, but not as much as I would have liked. Like, we were cruising out of New York at one point. You know, what a hub for music that is. You know, arguably none better. And people would ask me, "Oh, what did you get to see there?" And I said, "Well, nothing really in the way of music, because we would leave port by 6:30 p.m."
So you didn't get to see the nightlife.
Right, we're sailing away as, you know, Chick Corea's probably playing there, and bloody, you know, someone else there,
Wow.
and we're leaving town.
Yeah.
So that was frustrating in a way.
You do have a love for New Orleans-based music. Is that some place that you visited? Have you been there to see it? And what was that like?
Yeah. I first went in 1998. I was 17 and almost 18, and I just brought out a solo piano CD full of boogie-woogie, blues and stride and New Orleans funky stuff. And I had sort of acquired a pen pal friend in New Orleans named Tom McDermott, who's a wonderful pianist. He's featured in that Treme series. I don't know if you ever saw that. That was on HBO, all about the New Orleans music scene post-Hurricane Katrina.
Oh, wow. No, I haven't seen that.
And I sort of acquired him as a pen pal through a mutual pianist friend, and I had been writing backwards and forwards. He'd been sending me bootlegs of James Booker and all these New Orleans things that still haven't been released to this day. And it was wonderful. And when my first CD came out, I sent him a copy, and he said, "Hey, I reckon I could get you on this piano night concert at Tipitina's." Very prestigious concert, a very prestigious venue during the Jazz and Heritage Festival. And I said, "Geez, that would be amazing." That had sort of been a bit of a mini dream of mine, to go and play that venue.
Yeah.
So here it is, possibly on the cards, and through his authority on the piano scene over there, he was able to pull the strings and make that happen. So my dad and I flew over there in April of 98, and I performed as a 17-year-old solo at that venue. And
Wow.
that was fairly daunting. I've never been so nervous before a gig in my life. I was absolutely crapping myself. But somehow it came off great, and I was very well received, and went back and played it 3 more times.
Oh, yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah.
Is there footage of that?
I don't believe there's any footage of the first 3 times I went, 98, 99, 2000. The last time I played that event in 2007, I distinctly remember an enormous television-style camera on an enormous tripod. That was definitely being filmed. And after the gig had finished and I'd returned to New Zealand, I was living at the time, I made all sorts of efforts to obtain that footage and to no avail. Which still haunts me a little bit, because that was probably the best gig I've ever done in my life.
Oh, wow.
That last one
Yeah.
I did there.
Yeah, no, that would be a great thing to have footage of that.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing when you think back with what things are like now, where with people with phones with a camera in it, and everybody's filming everything, and it's quite easy to get footage of stuff. But yeah, I remember in nearly all the stuff that I did throughout my, particularly my 20s, there was virtually no record of it. I did some really interesting things. I mean, luckily enough, I did some stuff on TV, and people had VHS recorders and could record it off TV. You have obviously done quite a bit of recording. In what style is the recording sort of stuff that you've done? Like recording for other people, because you do session stuff as well. So what does that involve?
Well, I've only put out 4 albums, I believe, as a leader. First was at 17. I did a couple at age 20. I did a duet album with another pianist when I was about 19 or 20. So I really haven't put out more solo albums since I went away on ships and then subsequently moved to Australia. So I haven't really been promoting my art, but then, as I said, less than 5% of my gigs are solo. So
when you're doing the solo stuff, is that original material or covers?
Mostly covers, mostly things I've been playing for a long time, since I was a teenager. So
when you're doing the cover thing, is it your interpretation of those songs, or how do you go about doing that?
Some of the pieces I play, I've transcribed as near to note for note as I was able to, and continue to play them that way. And then other pieces I play might be just a standard that I've heard, or a more obscure old jazz piece from the Tin Pan Alley era that I really like, and I've somehow figured out my own version of it using substitute chords or a particular feel. So a bit of both. Something is strictly like the record, and some things are my own take.
Okay. Can you remember any of the stuff to give us a bit of an example?
Yeah. So I transcribed a lot of Fats Waller, a lot of Dr. John. One of the Dr. John things I transcribed probably 1995 or 6 was a tune called Delicato, which has got that funky rumba thing. It's sort of like...
Wow, very nice.
Yeah, things like that. Yeah.
So,
Sorry to get back briefly to the question about recording. So although I only did 4 records under my own name, I've probably contributed to 35 or 40 albums as a sideman pianist over the years. Most of those here in Australia. And those run the gamut from original pop songs to country, jazz, funk, blues, all sorts of things.
What are you drawing from? Say if you've got to do a funk thing, and those, when you're being a sideman thing, are they mainly piano, or are you doing other stuff? Like, did you ever get into the Stevie Wonder clav type vibe stuff, or?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm a huge funk fan and probably listen to more of that than any other genre. It's been that way for quite a while. Something about that style really speaks to me, and a lot of it is the keyboard sounds, the timbres of clavinet, Rhodes, Wurlitzer, electric piano. So yeah, I've certainly dabbled in those styles on gigs and on recording sessions I've done for people. Also, those sounds tend to have been easier to emulate authentically on keyboards than a piano. Piano seems to be very hard to genuinely, authentically emulate. I think they're still sort of struggling with that to this day. They're chipping away.
Yeah, I think we were talking about it before, and there's something about the harmonic content when you're sitting here in the room listening to it that an electronic duplication just doesn't translate in the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
So have that harmonic interaction between the notes.
Yeah.
And I guess it's that thing too, every piano does sound different. It's like a guitar. It's like you pick up, I could pick up 5 Les Pauls and they'll all be totally different. And for all intents and purposes look the same, but which is that strange combination of multitudes of different pieces of wood and whatever, and they interact and harmonically vibrate in different ways.
Pianos are like that, yes.
Yeah.
It's true.
When you're at home, do you spend much time practicing?
Not as much as I ought to, but I do think about it an awful lot, and not to in any way compare myself with Jaco Pastorius, but it was interesting to read in the biography of him by Bill Milkowski that he said he got to a point where he would sort of practice in his head, and you can even come up with new ideas away from the instrument. And that resonated with me. I thought, yeah, I do that sometimes. I'll not that I have perfect pitch, but I have very good relative pitch, enough where I can sort of flesh out ideas in my head, imagine myself playing them, hear them pretty darn clearly as to what they're going to sound, even if I haven't played them before necessarily. And then I can try that out on the next gig tonight or tomorrow night. And so that's a form of practicing that from what I understand, is sort of 98% neurologically identical to sitting down and playing it at the piano. So I don't want to sound like I'm cutting corners there and being lazy. I probably am being lazy. It's probably.
I guess the biggest thing is the music's happening in your head. I guess that's the only thing that you're missing out on then is the actual physicality of actually being able to execute it.
Right. It's doing it that way is not keeping your hands up to speed. And I do find I probably don't have the longevity for boogie woogie, particularly in my left hand, that I did in my teens.
Your hand gets tired after a while?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. If I did a whole gig of boogie woogie piano, I think I'd be pretty knackered in the left hand after that, whereas I probably wouldn't have at 17 or 18. But then, I don't know, maybe that's just a consequence of getting older.
There is that. It's also, I guess it is, there's a level, probably aspect of the actual physicality of practicing. Because if you're doing it all the time, it's something you probably don't lose as quickly as by not practicing. It's a strange one. It's a strange way to think about it. I know you've done a bunch of stuff with Aaron West, because last time you were in this studio, you were next door and recording with was it a 9-piece band? It was a large band with big horn section, great bunch of players. And there was 2 keyboards, because you had
John White.
John White playing. Was he playing piano or organ?
He was playing organ.
So you were playing piano and he was playing organ.
Yeah.
How do you guys, like when you're playing with another piano player or another keyboard player, how do you work out who's playing what parts and not stepping on each other's toes? How does that work?
Well, so I suppose it depends on the style. There's certain roles that certain keyboard sounds naturally sort of fill in. Like if you're playing strings and organ, for instance, there's a lot of pads, a lot of long notes associated with playing strings and organ. So you're sort of filling in a lot of gaps in the background. You're creating a bed of sound. And the piano might be playing more percussively on top of that, more staccato, more sporadically on top of that, while the organ or strings are laying down the bed. So sometimes it's just a matter of a particular keyboard sound requires a particular way of playing. If, for instance, we did a recording where I was playing piano and someone else was playing Rhodes, 2 instruments that fulfill largely the same kind of role, that might be trickier to figure out how we're going to navigate the space without treading on each other.
And then if you add a guitar in amongst that, it's
Yeah, that's tricky again.
tricky
yeah.
again. And that's the first time in that studio next door that I'd had, because that was, you were saying, was that 9 years ago?
It was almost to the day.
9 years ago, wow. That's gone really quick.
Yeah.
That was the first time that I'd ever had a band that big in the studio next door. And it really was a wonderful thing to hear the sound of that many people playing together in
Yeah.
the one room. I mean, I've done gigs where I've had a band with a horn section and stuff, but that was, I think it was like a 5 or 6 horns with the, and we were talking about earlier, there was a baritone sax, and it was the first time I'd ever heard a baritone sax live, and it was just like awesome.
Yeah, what a sound, hey? It's so grunty.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love Barry Sax.
You would have done quite a few gigs with Aaron West over the years.
Yeah, certainly have. Yeah, I've done a whole lot of gigs. He was one of the first musicians I met when I came to Australia. I came to Australia knowing a handful of blues guys on the scene in Brisbane through a mate of mine, the deceased Harry Miller, who had sort of a blues club in his basement in Norman Park, and he became a sort of a pen pal friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
He got a copy of my first CD in the late 90s. We started talking on the phone. He said, come over to Brisbane and stay with your dad, of course, and I'll take you around the blues scene. But apart from those blues guys, I didn't know anyone on the Gold Coast, didn't know anyone on any kind of jazz scene. Although, actually, it's not entirely true, because I'd come and done the Noosa Jazz Festival a couple of times years before I moved to Australia. Moved to Australia in 2008. But when I finally got to Oz in earnest in September 2008, I was a bit sort of directionless, didn't really know if this was a place I wanted to stay, try and make a go at. And I think it was I arrived on a Tuesday. On a Wednesday, I saw a poster in a shop window saying Jazz, Blues, Funk Jam, Swingin' Safari, Surface.
Oh, yeah, that was what a great venue.
Yeah.
With the Hanlons and
Yep.
the whole thing.
And it was the very next night. I saw it on a Wednesday. The gig advertised was the next night. I thought, I'm in there. I was staying in Surfers on a mate's couch in Chevron Island. So I thought, right, I'm there.
Yep.
So I rock up, and there's Willie Qua on drums.
Oh, wow.
Whose mother I happened to have met years earlier, a strange coincidence, down in Sydney.
And what a monster musician he was.
Yeah, Max Stowers on bass, who I recognised from I'd seen him playing with Nathan Haynes in New Zealand.
Yeah,
and
what
he
a
was
monster bass player.
such a monster. He was the best part of that gig with Nathan Haynes. It was a great band, but he stood out.
Yeah, okay.
He sort of carried them. It was amazing. I thought, gee, that guy Max is a killer. So Willie and Max, and then Adam Thomas on tenor and Westy on guitar, and I was greatly impressed with all of them. So I got to meet them, spoke to Westy at the bar, and was impressed with his knowledge of New Orleans piano, and I was able to tell him I'd been there and played, and he knew all these guys I was talking about.
Yeah, because he's a big fan of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was surprised that this Aussie guitarist knew so much about the New Orleans piano lineage. And Westy and Willie Qua flatted together at that time, only 2 blocks from Swingin' Safari. So after the gig was done, come round. There's a piano at home. Let's you talk the talk, can you walk the walk, sort of thing. And
Yeah.
And I played, and he saw that I was not full of it, and friendship was born, and we still gig together fairly often to this day.
So you did play for Galapagos Duck, and I've had Rod Ford on the podcast, and he speaks about playing in the band. How did that come about, and what was that like?
Well, it came about through. It got to the point where, to carry on from the story I just finished, it got to a point where I became good friends with Willie as well. Willie and Westy were...
Because Willie was in Galapagos Duck.
Yeah.
And Adam Thomas plays sax in Galapagos Duck now too.
He does, yeah. As of post sort of COVID era, he's in the band with Mal Wood out the front. So band sounding better than ever, to be honest. No disrespect to Willie, but he was pretty
erratic.
Erratic. Would find any reason to not read the dots on the page. The lighting. I've left my glasses at home. He was not a great reader by his own admission, and so a lot of those arrangements were pretty frayed around the edges. And a couple of occasions I've sat in with the band since COVID. I'm no longer in the band since COVID. I'll tell you about that later. I got stuck back in New Zealand during COVID and was replaced in the band. No one knew when I'd be coming back, not even myself.
Yeah.
But the times I've sat in with the band since COVID, I've thought the band's sounding better than ever. Now we've got horn players who read the bloody charts properly. But But I became friends with Willie at the same time as I became friends with Westy, and I was hanging out at their apartment in Enderley Avenue there quite a lot. Ended up living there with Willie for 5 years in that apartment. And right around that time, the incumbent pianist in the Duck was Matt Baker, and I think he just recently gone to live in New York City, where he is to this day. So that chair was open, and Willie said, "Want to do it?" And I said, "Sure," and that was really all it was.
Did you do any recording with Galapagos Duck?
Yeah, we did an album in 2015, I think it was, at Billy Field's studio Paradise was in Sydney, of course. He moved it up to Gosford, Central Coast.
Yep.
All of the same gear, bloody gold records on the wall, Hammond organ, all this great gear.
All the good stuff.
Grand piano. So it was, and recording straight to tape. So editing was virtually not on the cards.
For a band like Galapagos Duck, that would be perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I take your point. There was a couple of clams that would have been nice to have gotten rid of, but I don't think Billy was too keen to pull out the razor blade and start slicing the tape. But that's fine. There's a charm to recording to tape, isn't there?
I think there is definitely that, and it's the fact that things aren't perfect, I think, gives them a certain amount of charisma and charm anyway.
Yeah, totally.
That was one of the great things about recording to tape was there's not the opportunity to quantize the drummer.
That's right.
Fix the bass note that's out of time.
Yes.
And those little things, they give a certain humanness to everything. I think that's particularly coming into where we're sort of heading now into the world of AI.
For sure.
And the lack of humanness in music.
Oh yeah, it's a pet peeve of mine. I could whinge about that all day. I'll spare you that, but we might be on the same page there. Yeah, everything sounds so quantized. It sounds so looped.
And pitch correction and all of the things that go along with the technical possibilities of what you can do now is incredible. And you would think with all of those technical possibilities that the world of music would be opening up. But in actual fact, it seems to be more and more closing, getting into and getting more of the same. Instead of having variety, everything's becoming more homogenized.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Yeah, it would be nice to hear more dynamic range, more instruments that are clearly played live by a human, warts and all. I'd love that. I miss that, and it's part of the reason why I listen to so little modern pop music and find myself listening to music from generations past almost all of the time.
I had Christian O'Donnell, and his podcast has only just been out recently as we're recording this, and he's a massive fan of Jacob Collier. Is that someone like of the modern type composers that have you listened to much of his stuff?
Not a great deal. I have vast respect for his abilities, and I think he's a phenomenal teacher, and perhaps in the long run that may be his most enduring legacy, is his ability to convey complicated ideas in a way that plebs can grasp. I think
because I said to him about going and seeing Jacob Collier live, and I said to him, was there, he said, well, the room was definitely full of musicians. It's music for musicians, not necessarily for the general public. Although I imagine that he would there would be a certain element of general public who would appreciate it, I would imagine.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to be a musician to appreciate complex melody and harmony.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, I think there becomes a point, particularly at the sort of bebop end of complexity, where there's so much going on. It's a barrage of harmonies flying past, rhythms, counter rhythms, where I do start to suspect when I hear a pleb, and I don't mean that term to be as derogatory as it might come across, a non-musician, let's say, there does come a point where if I hear a strong fan of bebop who's not a player at all, I think, I don't know, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, is this not pretentiousness? Do you understand what's going on? It's a bit like if I sat down and read a Stephen Hawking book. Is this not all going over my head? It probably is, but yeah, I don't know.
This is one of the things I'm curious about with piano, and I think of it as being quite a mathematical instrument.
Yeah.
Is mathematics something that you did well at school?
Pretty well, yeah. Certainly above average. I wouldn't say I was a mathematical prodigy, but it was one of my better subjects.
Do you understand where I'm coming from with the application of mathematics with the piano?
Oh, big time.
Because it's basically a little group of notes duplicated over and over and over. Like it is, it's sort of funny how incredibly simple a piano would seemingly be, and yet how complex the music that comes from it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I tend to think, and I've thought more as I've got older, that all music is reducible to numbers. Jazz musicians tend to think of all notes, 12 notes in the chromatic scale, as numbers, as entities that can be called upon in any given situation. And it's really just a spectrum of most appropriate to most inappropriate. So if I'm in C, a C or an E or a G are about the most appropriate notes I could play in that moment. They're perfectly consonant. They create no dissonance whatsoever. A D flat or a G flat are right at the other end of the scale. They're most inappropriate. Now there's ways you can wiggle that to make it appropriate in some sort of a way. That's dissonance. You know, to me it's all about implying how much consonance, how much dissonance do you want at any given moment.
And I guess that's the thing too with dissonance. It does lend itself to a resolution back to a more consonant chord. If you were to use, like you were talking about before, we were talking about diminished chords and augmented chords we were talking about before. That's the sort of this. I guess they're used more in a jazz context than they are in a pop context. Although if you go back to the 70s, there was a lot of pop music that incorporated a lot of that stuff. Were you ever a fan of Steely Dan?
Yeah, I was. I never had any of their albums, but I appreciated that what the pop music they were putting out was on a level of sophistication that was far beyond most pop music. And you could hear that there was some jazz sensibility in the writing and in the playing. So respect to them for that.
Yeah. So the gigs that you're playing now, what style of music are you playing?
Mostly just what I'd call mainstream jazz, I guess. Swing, blues, sort of what some people would call straight ahead jazz.
Okay, so can you give me an example of that? Like, not necessarily playing, but like what would be an example of a song that's mainstream straight ahead jazz?
Well, in the 50s, and early 60s, I mean, that's an era when modal jazz and post-bop and a lot of quite avant-garde stuff started to appear. But nonetheless, 50s, probably more than 60s, is probably the decade most characterized with straight-ahead jazz. The music of Oscar Peterson Trio,
yes.
Ahmad Jamal, George Shearing, Errol Garner, quite swinging, quite happy.
But with a lot of melody.
Yeah, a lot of melody, and also recycling a lot of the repertoire of the Tin Pan Alley era from a generation prior, the 20s, 30s standards. Miles recycled an awful lot of standards from the 20s and 30s in his 50s recordings. So although he was pushing the envelope stylistically, he was still drawing from that well of a generation prior of a repertoire. And a lot of 50s mainstream jazz is that.
And when you're doing a lot of that stuff, is there ever a singer involved, or is it mainly just instrumental?
Quite often a singer involved. I work with a few singers. Sometimes a singer will come through town from Sydney or Melbourne or even overseas and want to put a band together, and I might get the call for something like that, turn up and read the charts and go home. I like that sort of work. That's classic sideman sort of work that I wish there was more of. That's probably slowed a little since COVID. But yeah, I play with singers around the Brisbane area. There's some very good ones. I like that sort of work. Accompaniment is a skill in and of itself. It's almost often another branch of the tree. You can be an excellent pianist and know nothing about accompaniment. It's a particular skill. I wouldn't say I'm a master at it, but probably above average.
Coming into 2025, things are actually looking quite busy for you. What gigs are you doing at the moment? Where can people come and see you play?
So I play quite often at a restaurant in the Valley in Brisbane called SK Steak and Oyster in James Street, the Carlisle Hotel precinct there. A very swanky part of town, always stunningly beautiful women and Lamborghinis driving around. You can tell that's the hub of money and sophistication now. It's certainly left the Brunswick Street Mall area in the dust. I don't know if that area was ever classy, but the James Street is streets ahead of that now. So I play there at SK in a duo with various singers or occasionally a bassist playing instrumental straight ahead jazz. I play Brisbane Jazz Club quite a lot with all sorts of acts. I'm in a Sting tribute band called Blue Turtles.
Oh, I've seen that. That's who's the singer? It's
often Stacey Hoy.
okay. Who's a great singer.
Oh yeah, wonderful. Neil Wickham runs that band and has done all the groundwork, meticulously transcribed and arranged everything. He's a real gun.
Like, I'd imagine that would be enjoyable material to play.
Yeah, like the Steely Dan stuff. It's a level of sophistication above most pop music. It's really quite hip. It bridges the gap between what musicians want to play and what punters want to hear quite nicely, I think. Music of Sting. I'm in a funk band called Funky Miracle that plays at the Bearded Lady and elsewhere in Brisbane. That's, I don't know if you know Dr. Bob. You know Robert Harley, the bassist from Brisbane?
I don't know. I don't.
He runs that. Various little things. I've got my hand in all sorts of pies. Doo-bop occasionally, the Regatta Hotel in Toowong. Yeah, I'm all around the place.
Over all of the time that you've basically been playing music, has there been a time when you thought you might have to give music up in order to go and earn money in any other way, or has music always been you've always had an ability to earn an income and make a living playing music? I guess it's that thing. I would imagine there were times when things are quite good and things aren't so good. I mean, COVID was one of those times when I think it was crap for everyone.
Yeah.
But can you think of times when things weren't so good and that you were worried about whether you'd be able to continue playing music?
There were certainly times, particularly when I first moved to Oz, it was very slow getting things up off the ground, and I was sort of relying on word of mouth to have my reputation circle around the Gold Coast scene. I was living on the Gold Coast until 2019 when I moved to Brisbane finally. But I'm not a very entrepreneurial person at all. I could be doing far more to promote my brand. But, I mean, why that is, I don't know. I'm not a shrink, but I suppose I'm...
I can to some degree understand that. There is also probably a level, and this was what happened for me, where I played through a period in the 80s and the 90s, but where there was so much work, you didn't have to go out and chase it. People were chasing you for work. And we've come to a point in time now where while people still seek you out for work, there is a level of, if you want to be busy, you have to go out and find it for yourself to some degree. And it's not a skill that I've ever really worked on or developed massively, and I would imagine that's probably what you're referring to. It's more a case of people have sought you out because of your skills and your reputation, and you get to rely on that to a certain degree.
Yeah, it's kept me alive and fed and clothed and housed to this point, and a little bit of overseas travel here and there. Do I wish for a great deal more? Probably not. I mean, I've somewhat jokingly said to friends, if I could change my life to be the ideal scenario in any way, I'd probably just say every gig I do pays twice as much. I wouldn't be greedy. I don't want to earn $1 million a year. I just want to be relatively more comfortable, respected among my peers, and able to play at a fairly high level. And I don't sort of want too much more than that. But to get back to your question about has it ever felt so dire that I thought I might have to look further afield in order to survive beyond music? I'm reminded of what's that guitarist's name? Charlie, that played with D'Angelo. He's got like the bass and guitar in one instrument, with the bass with the thumb and the guitar with the rest of his fingers. He was doing a workshop, concert/workshop that I saw on YouTube, and at the end of the concert, he took questions from the audience, and one of the questions was, what advice would you give to an aspiring player who wants to make this his career? And I always remembered the response. Charlie said, unless you have to do this, Unless you would be utterly despondent and miserable doing anything else for a living, don't do it. And that's me. That's the camp I'm in. I have to do this. I don't know what else I'd do. So I think, this is me until the bitter end.
Yeah, it is always a case of you've got to spend your time doing something. I'd much rather be performing, but there is a case for at least being able to make a living wage.
Yes, yeah.
It can be a difficult thing to do, but it is definitely possible. Do you have anything that you'd like to do that you haven't done?
Well, I watched the podcast you did with Chris Palmer, and I liked what he said on that. He'd like to do an album of original material one day. I think I would too. I'm not a prolific writer, and I've never written anything with lyrics, only instrumental piano pieces. But it would be nice to have an entire album of original material out there. So, not that I'm actively working towards that, but that would be nice at some point. I'd like to travel more internationally, get back to New Orleans and maybe play in New York, explore Japan, because there's a real love of jazz there that is probably leading the way.
Japan is a massive market. I know that's one of those things where a lot of American acts tour there, and they are great lovers of all sorts of music, which is an interesting concept for a country that doesn't speak English.
Yeah,
particularly if you're playing instrumental jazz, it's perfect for like you play it anywhere in the world. It's still music.
Yeah.
It doesn't need a language to go with it.
Well, why do the countries that like jazz the most, the countries that were the most militarily interfered with by the United States, Germany, Western Europe, Japan. Anyway, that's a whole can of worms. But yeah, it is interesting that Japan has such a deep love for baseball, jazz, these core aspects of American culture. So I'd like to get over there and get into that.
Well, I hope that I get the chance to come up and see you play live in the near future, because it's something that I don't get out and often see as many people as I'd like to. I don't know, there's the Brisbane, for those people who are watching who don't know, the Gold Coast is about, depending on traffic, an hour's drive, an hour and a half. If things are really bad, maybe 2 hours.
Yeah, can be shocking.
Can be. I saw a thing the other day where they said the traffic in Brisbane now is worse than it is in any other part of Australia.
Yeah.
And worse than, I think, LA, which can, from what I can imagine, be quite bad with traffic at times. There's always a lot of roadworks between the coast and Brisbane, and particularly it's gotten particularly bad between the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane.
Yeah, I'll say.
So I guess it makes sense to live in Brisbane like you do and do all the gigs just around that are close by.
Yeah. Yeah, it's grown on me as a city. It's not bad.
Well, I'd like to say thank you very much for spending some time with me this afternoon.
Pleasure, Scotty. Thank you.
Thank you for watching, and we'll hopefully see you all on the next podcast. Cheers.